thanks to LSI for your inaugural event here. I personally am very excited. I had the chance to be at Dana Point early on this year, and it's so great to see many familiar faces here in Singapore as well. So thanks to LSI. And nice to see you again, Dan.
Thanks, John. Good to be here.
Yeah.
And also extend my appreciation, and it's an honor to be here with LSI, at this conference. So looking forward to this session.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's actually, shall we start by taking a quick round of introductions? Yeah, maybe I'll turn the mic over to you first. Maybe a quick introduction of yourself. Actually, how long have you been in Singapore?
Yeah.
And since you're in Singapore, do you have any favorite local cuisine?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just a little bit about, so I'm based here in Singapore. I've not for that long, actually. I sort of grew up in this region, and, the accent is Australian. So I was part of the Asia Pac region from the early stage of my career. Lived and worked a long time in the US and Europe, now making my way back and have the privilege of being based in Singapore with Edwards Lifesciences, leading their Japan, Greater China, and Asia Pacific commercial businesses across Edwards Lifesciences. So I've been at Edwards for a decent amount of time. It's my 15th anniversary just passed, and so I've been with Edwards for quite a long time. And most of that experience has been living the transcatheter aortic valve replacement journey with Edwards Lifesciences. So my perspective that I'm bringing here is quite maybe narrow and selective, but it's an interesting perspective nonetheless, given Edwards' innovation model and commitment to a narrow innovation model. So that's the bit of background. Now, I've been here 18 months, right? Living not far from Newton, MIT, so it's a nice convenient spot. And favorite foods, I have a lot. I mean, there's one sort of thing that is a struggle for me is how much of the local food that I consume. So I have to be very active while I'm here because I love it all. But probably, apart from all the favorites of satés and laksas and nasi lemak and all that good stuff, but I am a fan of spicy food. And so I actually really like the proximity that we have here to Southeast Asia for Thai and for Indian and for even, Chinese food. And so might surprise people how much heat I can handle in my local foods, but it's been fun so far.
Well, I know where to ask you for lunch or dinner next time.
Yeah, I'm keeping a list of.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Maybe just a quick one of introduction of myself as well. So myself, I'm John. I represent Singapore EDB. Singapore EDB is a government agency, traditionally been working with global enterprises really all over the world, many of them at the conference today as well, to explore Singapore, explore Asia for growth opportunities. I'm based in Singapore now. I used to live in Chicago as well for 3 years, but currently I'm based in Singapore. I lead the Medtech practice for us, and Medtech is a big sector for Singapore as well. Being in the Ritz, you can't imagine it, but as a small island country, we produce about $19 billion of medical devices every year. There are 16,000 of us in the sector, producing life science tools, implantables, as well as other kinds of devices in this very exciting space. So nice to be here, and thanks again, LSI.
And a decent amount of heart valves as well.
For sure. Yeah. So maybe we can get things started. So the title is What's Holding Asia Back in Medtech? Actually, when it comes to Medtech, I think what comes to mind first is US and Europe, right? As a launch market, and definitely where innovations originate from. Actually, from your standpoint and your experiences so far, do you agree with that? And has it always been the case, US and Europe?
First of all, the title is provocative for a reason, right? There's a lot to be excited about, but we're going to focus on perhaps the perspective of perhaps imagining a future. But to answer the question, yeah, I think it's fair. It's fair to say, especially when you look at it from an MNC perspective, is that the focus has historically been US and Europe. It hasn't always been consistent, and we can get into that, especially over the last 15 years. There's been some major shifts that have kind of changed the game when it comes to how you apply an innovation model or parts of the journey of the innovation model in those different regions. But I think that that's fair. And I think with everything else that's going on in the world right now, which is kind of dynamic, right, is it's starting to sharpen the focus again, right? And I think that that's something that we all need to be aware of. So to, broadly speaking, I would say, yeah, that's fair, but not necessarily always the same way, right?
Got it. Actually, the TAVR story is an interesting one. One that my team and I look through every now and then. How it originated and how the technology evolved based on the environment. Do you want to share a bit of insights there?
Well, maybe I can. I mentioned that like the US, Europe. So looking at through the lens of TAVI, if you like, one of the things that has been a game changer through the lens of this type of technology and the relative value that each region brings to the innovation process, right? I would say that where there has been a big shift is even at the beginning of, like going back 15 years, maybe 20 years, Europe was the obvious place to do early clinical work or early studies for a new technology. And the reason for that is you had a very predictable regulatory pathway that could give you access to a lot of countries and markets, but it was fast. You didn't have to go through all the heavy, the rigorous, heavy steps of an FDA approval or a PMDA approval in Japan. So it naturally attracted the entire industry towards Europe. So this is, a competitive advantage for a region to attract investment. And US was a huge market and still is, and provided a lot of value and a consistent patient access perspective. And so the end game might have been to go to, to get an FDA approval, but your early work always, typically happened in Europe. What's shifted in the last 5 years, which has been quite interesting to watch, is how the FDA has, and in combination, with CMS, who pays for a lot of this sort of stuff, have been a lot more competitive and made active decisions to try and attract early clinical work to the US at the same time, exactly the same time that there's medical device regulation reform going on in Europe, right? So now you take an incentive and a motivated government or region to try and attract investment, and you've got the incumbent who is going through change and going through a reform that makes it less reliable and less clear. And then this completely changes from an MNC where you invest and why you invest and where you decide to do your clinical work. And from my viewpoint, it was a very sharp shift, right? At least from what I could observe of investments moving out of Europe into the US, right? And that has an impact on the whole ecosystem, right? There are physicians, there are universities, there are hospitals that have built an infrastructure based on this, and there is an investment stream that kind of changes overnight, and it kind of disrupts the whole ecosystem. Over that time period, my responsibilities were based in Europe. And I, come from a position of trying to fight for Europe, trying to bringing these investments and these things. You can even imagine the conversations inside of Edwards Lifesciences about, hey, let's not be so rash about making the decision about doing this or doing that. But it's a real decision, a real discussion. And the point that I'm trying to make is that the regions where investment goes for innovation, it has to be logical. It has to be competitive, right? And it has to be sustainable, and you have to have a pathway. If you have a long-term view, you have to have a pathway whereby the risk that you're willing to take, there has to be a known ecosystem of points of failure and reward. And I think that is something that, as we go through this conversation, as we go through what's holding Asia back is where in that ecosystem can we be strong and can we provide that value, and where is it maybe more transactional and we have work to do if we want to compete against US, Europe from an innovation perspective. But hopefully that's some background. Now, as far as the TAVI story, there's so many different rabbit holes we could go down, but I'm happy to share some perspective if it's interesting to either to the audience or to you, John.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe I can call on that as we go through, I think, our conversation today. Yeah, there's a lot of learnings from the TAVI example for sure. Yeah. But I thought the points that you shared earlier on are really salient and also a very good reminder. I think we all know it's never just only about the product. I think it's about getting a product to market in order to get that impact. And the second point is getting it into market. Again, it's also not about the product. It's really about the larger environment, whether it's regulations, government support, or even, I think, for Medtech, the availability of the best clinicians to help you get to market. And the third thing that I perhaps take away is also then the importance of the continued importance of that ecosystem approach. Because like you said, you don't want this to be just a transactional, short-term kind of view. You want long-term, you want predictability. And I think for us, we also want to generate a flywheel of an ecosystem in Asia as well to do Medtech.
So a lot of people, and especially our customers, like, when you're working with the physicians who ultimately apply the technologies to treat their patients, we end up in conversation thinking that innovation is a choice, that Edwards Lifesciences chooses an innovation strategy, right? I think that the nature of our narrow focus demands that you have to have an innovation strategy. Otherwise, you become irrelevant pretty quickly, right? I think but the choice is actually the physicians. If there's no value in innovation, no company is going to invest, no venture capitalist is going to invest. Even if there's a clinical unmet need, even if there's a need for innovation, if there's no value in it, then it's a difficult strategy. So if you think about a company like Edwards who has a narrow focus in an area that there's huge clinical unmet need, the sustainability and the ecosystem there has to be a pathway for reward, because the innovation process is a super commitment, right? It's, we as a company, we spend, and it's very public, we spend close to 20% of our revenue back into R&D. Very little of that is actually idea generation, right? The innovation that is required to transform a therapy or to change the practice of medicine in a particular therapeutic area, the lift is massive across the ecosystem. So, this concept of not having a sustainable recognition of value as you go through that journey is a scary one, particularly if you're in it for the long term.
That's right.
There's plenty of opportunity in the short term for everybody, but not necessarily if you have a very long-term view.
Yeah, really tests the resolve, and I have a lot of respect for innovators.
Yeah, I guess you may kiss more frogs than you wish to get to any kind of princess or prince. So it's not for the faint-hearted, I guess.
Yeah, but actually, then if I double-click on Asia and just draw on your wealth of experiences in this part of the world as well, do you think there's an area that Asia can be competitive in when it comes to medtech innovation? And where have you seen some of those, actually?
I mean, I don't think I would be here if I wasn't as intoxicated by the opportunity as I think everybody is.
Nice.
There's a big difference. I probably spent 20 years away from Asia, if you like. And it's interesting for me to come back and see the observation and the change, right? And I think, 20 years ago, I think, the value that was being created here in Asia was based on cost of labor, right, and manufacturing. And I think that was just an obvious, it was a competitive, I guess, point of differentiation that provided access to, to the conversation or to, into the industry. Now you see a lot more capability being built and available everywhere. It's not necessarily coordinated. It's not necessarily accessible all the way through. It's not necessarily visible. But when you live it, you see, how digital the population here is, how tech forward the population is, and that creates opportunity, right? I think you just have to go through an airport in the US and then come back home and go, wow, we really do things quite forward, in a forward way of thinking here. And so this is opportunity. This, from a medtech perspective, not easy to harness, but creates opportunity. The second thing that I would say that's always the superpower of this region is the population. And that population, by the way, is massive. Yep. So from an unmet need, from a clinical unmet need perspective, is always been there. By the way, it was there 20 years ago, but it's always there. The challenge is accessing it in a reliable, predictable way. But that population is also becoming more educated with every generation and more wealthy with every generation. And that in itself drives change, right? And demands different solutions. And so there's opportunity in that. Everything that I've spoken about so far would be largely transactional opportunity from a supplier perspective, or that you look at that and go, wow, that might be an interesting market, if you like, because of that happening. The question then becomes is, how do you operationalize that for it to be competitive or an interesting way to invest in, because it might bring value outside of Asia, right? I still think that there is more value in Asia for Asia than there is in Asia or outside of Asia. And I think that's the transformation that would be interesting if it could happen, that would change the value proposition of this region from a medtech innovation leadership perspective.
I like what you just said. I think that's exciting for us, and why I think very excited to have LSI here is being able to firstly understand the tremendous need in Asia, but secondly, are there solutions that Asia can generate to solve Asia's needs while also thinking about bringing it to the rest of the world. So,
but I'm sure the audience would agree it's a lot easier to say than to do, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think what you also mentioned, as companies think about Asia, the first thought is cost of labor arbitrage, and it's manufacturing, and then they think about market, right? And then we think about what's next for Asia, given the evolution. To some sense, as you're sharing that, I'm also thinking about our journey as a tiny island in Singapore.
It's fascinating, John. As I'm sitting here, I'm like, hey, this is how Edwards thinks about the innovation process from a company perspective, from a long-term strategy perspective. And then I realized, wow, Singapore has a reputation for being very strategic in the way that the government thinks long-term and thinks about its planning and all those sorts of things. And I'm sure the EDB does the same thing. So I'm curious to hear from you about how you and your position at the EDB looks at the same opportunity and challenges. Is there something that either resonates or is different from the EDB perspective as we're having this conversation?
Well, I definitely, I think broadly, I think there are similarities. I think for us, as a country, we constantly have to stay on our toes, on figuring out, where is innovation happening and how do we think a few steps ahead, alongside the industry. Yeah, so I think for us, Singapore is not a large country. I said a few times actually. We are about 5 million people, 5 to 6 million people. And naturally, when they think of Singapore, it's not for the market in terms of its size, but traditionally they think of Singapore as a location whereby, we've got good physicians. We've got a relatively good health system. We've got processes. And to your point about predictability, I think we are relatively predictable. We like to think so, vis-a-vis many other parts of the world today. So traditionally, in spite of our size, I think where Singapore features in company's Asia strategy is a location for launch, right? We talked about TAVR. I think surgical robotics is another exciting area. I think the first robotic-assisted surgery was done in Singapore in the 1999. For TAVR as well, I was looking the other day. I think the first procedure for TAVR was done in Singapore as well for Asia, in I think the early 2010s. Yeah, so I think in general that has been how companies think of Singapore. We have a bit of a manufacturing base as well, and it all starts with the precision manufacturing sector here. By legacy, Singapore was low cost, but we built from there. And I think today, beyond just being a location for launch and training of physicians, Singapore continues to do a bit of manufacturing using technology, as I mentioned, about 19 billion of that. But I think how we are evolving as well, just like I think the trajectory you've outlined is, I think we've got decent technical talent here. With an environment that is close to Asia, relatively representative of that diversity that's in Asia, right? Because you talk about Asia, is not a homogeneous 3 billion market. It's really, really fragmented. But a lot of that diversity is represented in the microcosm that's in the Singapore. So I think we are starting to see companies actually do a lot more in innovation here. As a trusted location for companies, right, who are interested to innovate in this part of the world, very often for Asia, as you were saying. So
gone through the same evolution that I was talking about from my own personal observations, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I was taking down notes about what you were saying. A couple of hashtag predictability market in Asia for Asia. These were things that. Somehow or another, in reflection, are things that we've kind of gone through the journey as well. Yeah,
you mentioned predictability. I think what people underappreciate in the innovation cycle, or the journey that you go on from taking an idea to a reality or transformation in medicine, is how important trust is.
Yep.
Right? You cannot work with people that you don't trust, because you're going to fail more often than you're going to succeed. The rapid learning that is required and the comfort in the learning, or the application of the learning, is so fundamental that if you're doing it with unknown entities, with unknown countries, with unknown physicians, or in an unpredictable environment, it's just hard to go on that journey, right? And so I think this is an area where if Asia wants and can, I truly believe they can, be more prominent in how they're part of the innovation story outside of Asia for MNCs that are based outside of Asia, then there has to be a predictability or a way to generate and create and cultivate trust. And I think that's something that you probably, and with the Singapore government and EDB, have probably realized as well, is that you can have a great idea, you can have an interesting pitch, but at the end of the day, it's still people and and entities working together on a common goal that makes it viable. So it's something that I think about a lot, because these are the conversations that I have with my partners and colleagues based in the United States all the time about, well, why would we do it here versus there, or why wouldn't we do it like this, or with that person, or whatever. And it's always ends up coming down to a relationship, trust-based decision making. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. Trust is built on communication, and I think a very common challenge or opportunity, actually, some people really love it, is the diversity of the different cultures as well. So in Asia, you are not dealing with just one market. It's so many different markets. So really kudos to all the people who are working in the Asia Pacific commercial region. It's not easy navigating across the different markets.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cultural context and all.
A lot of cultural challenges. We have a lot of diversity.
Yeah.
Not necessarily always a lot of tolerance.
Yeah.
And I think that's, it's very real. You have a lot of languages, and that's what makes it beautiful. And there is so much opportunity, but at the same time, it's hard to harness as a region, right? Because a lot of that gets then trapped within the invisible walls of a country border limits. And so, again, Europe takes advantage of having a European Commission and centralized policy.
Yep.
And that works to their advantage when it comes to attracting certain investments, in Medtech and biopharma and all those sorts of things. We don't get to benefit from those same types of, governance, but we have other opportunities. One of the challenges that we face and we will continue to face with an aging population and a population problem is the rising costs of healthcare.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
and the fact that there's always been, for as long as that I have been involved in the medtech space, there has always been unlimited demand for healthcare and limited budgets. That's always been the case. This is nothing new. This is not a 2025 problem or a 2030 problem. So access to care has been and always will be a challenge. The concept of cutting your way to the solution is going to lead to probably quite disappointing results, right? So, I have a personal saying that you can't cut your way to the top. You can't cut your way to growth, right? So how you make investments and how you have strategies to deal with these problems and invest in the right innovations that are either capacity building or value creating or problem solving in the right way requires strategy and leadership.
Yeah. I think these are challenges that we have to kind of navigate as we think about, better quality care. That to your point earlier on, as well as the education becomes more sophisticated, they're going to want better care as well. Yeah. You mentioned trust. You mentioned, dealing with healthcare costs. Are there one or two other key challenges you think Asia will face in terms of being a medtech giant?
Well, I think it's related, and it's in access to innovation. So innovation by nature is supposed to bring value to the system. Innovation is expensive in terms of it's an expensive journey to go on. Not saying that innovation has to be expensive to acquire, but the process of innovation and the ecosystem of innovation is if it was easy, then everyone would be doing it, and we wouldn't be having these meetings, and we wouldn't have the people that are in this room and at this conference. And so it does require a level of commitment, courage, and budget, to a sustainable budget to try and execute. People go on that journey because you believe at the end of the day that if you crack the code on something, or if you're able to deliver on the promise of whatever the idea might be, you can change the way that we do things for the better. In this instance, it's in how medicine might be applied for a particular medical condition or disease state patient. And that has to bring value to the system. Value in that is worth paying for. Yeah. And then it is worth going again. And it is worth sort of feeding itself to bring better solutions over time to care. And I think we've got an enormous amount of history of that in all types of medicine over the last 100 years. It's amazing how far we've progressed, but you're only going to invest in things that bring value, and that value gets rewarded. Yes. So the idea of not getting reward for that value is challenging, right? And I think that's, when we apply when we look at this region, we look at the markets within this region, and you look at the predictability or the nature of how innovation is being either regulated or valued, then it becomes a big deal in terms of how patients get access to it, right? And every one of these decisions and every one of these markets is going to be looked at differently, even if there is a huge unmet need because of that very equation, right? And I think that's just the harsh reality. So the big challenge for the region is having a predictable access, patient access strategies for meaningful innovation. And I think that that is a life's work.
Yeah. I think for us as well, I think for Singapore, we are watching healthcare costs very closely. And to your point, it's not just about putting in subtractions. I think it's also generating, taking a more data-backed, evidence-based approach. And to your point, I think technologies in precision medicine actually allow us to better quantify some of these outcomes as we then put that into the equation, which may or may not need to be updated, to your point, so that the best technologies can get to patients at the right time. Yeah.
And again, maybe it's less interesting in this part, but the reality is that you can bring an enormous amount of value to a society, right? You can bring an enormous amount of difference with an innovation in Medtech that changes the quality adjusted life year or changes the quality of life in general of a patient. And from a society perspective, that's valuable. But maybe at a hospital economic level, like, for an annual budget, it's unhelpful.
Yeah.
And so there's sometimes these things are two different types of economics and two different types of decision making. In fact, every day it's different. They're at odds with each other.
That's right.
That also makes it difficult for innovation to live, right? But these are the sorts of things that, that's part of the challenge. That's part of the whole process. When it is one system like the United States, you got a clear goal to go focus, right?
That's right.
When it's one policy that you need to change in Europe, it's clearer.
Yeah.
When it's 45 different countries with their own thing, and by province it's different and all that sort of stuff, it makes it harder to harness the opportunity and create solutions for patient access. And I think that's the big challenge that we have in Asia, but it doesn't change the fact that the opportunity isn't there.
Yeah.
It just means that the opportunity requires a lot more work.
Yeah. Capacity, hopefully more predictability in the future. Yeah. But actually then to that point, I think, where do you see bright spots for Asia when it comes to Medtech in terms of technologies? Since you're out here at LSI, are there certain technologies you feel Asia can take the lead? You mentioned digital.
Well, that's the obvious one, and it's not so relevant in my world, but there's massive opportunity there, right? And there's actually I was just having dinner last night with colleagues who are here from Israel who are working in our plant in Singapore, testing different theories and ideas around different applications of AI-based things. And it's like, oh, wow, I didn't even know that, this was happening in my backyard. But it's fantastic. There is a real opportunity for that in this region and the application in healthcare. And I think, I think that this is an area where Asia could disrupt. Right. But like you said, with the EDB and with Singapore, it's a competitive world out there. It's one thing to sort of disrupt one time, and there's another thing to do it sustainably over and over again and lead, the process of disruption from a long-term perspective. And so I think from that perspective, for sure, digital application, it's a region that is very data forward.
Yep.
Right? Healthcare is often, not everywhere, but in major markets is data forward and smart in its application, right? And so there's opportunity there. I think that, like you mentioned, from a skills perspective,
yeah,
I think that we have a lot of skills technical skills in the region that creates opportunity, from the innovation. There may not be the end-to-end attractiveness to take advantage of those skills, but they're there. And then, like I said before, the population and the access to talent and the mindset that people have here. It's amazing how passionate people are in this region. You forget sometimes, and so there is a willingness here that doesn't exist anywhere else. An ambition that exists here that is quite different, and I think that can be harnessed in a very positive way as well.
Yeah, that's very good to hear. Technology-wise, are there things besides digital you're looking for, you think?
I think
that's the big core of it.
I think that there are a lot of, actually there's a lot of interesting technologies that are coming out of this region.
Yeah.
But they're going to struggle to live outside the region.
Oh,
and I think that's kind of like, I think that right now when I look at a lot of the technologies and ideas, first of all, that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago or 25 years ago. So the fact that it's happening is a shift.
Right.
And that's amazing. That's creating a lot of opportunity and I would imagine why there's a lot of people at this conference is there's a lot of really interesting things that are happening. The quality of those new innovations coming out of the region are also, I wouldn't say consistent, but you can get really high quality as well. But it is I think that at the moment it's still transactional, right? It's still going to be early stage without it's going to be idea creation, idea exit type thing. It's hard to imagine something that is going to be generated here or anything that I'm seeing that's generated that's actually going to be developed here and then changed within the life cycle. So, but robotics is an area that I think in this region, particularly surgical robotics, cardiovascular robotics is an area that I think will explode here before it does in the West. And that is just because the patients demand it. And I think that it's going to create opportunities in that space that is probably led through demand here, which I think is super exciting.
Yeah. Well, it addresses one of the key gaps in this part of the world, which is there's not enough clinicians to deliver the increasing level of care that all of us require. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for sharing with us your insights. I really loved the stories that you shared from your experiences living in this part of the world and actually in the US as well. Thanks for sharing. I think you raised a couple of points for Asia that I think we in this part of the world can think about. I think certainly dealing with that cost dynamic. How do you think about value-based care option versus just a focus on cost? I think that's food for thought. For Singapore, we think about it in terms of having more data to back up some of these interventions. But that's something for us to think about. The second is a wish list that I think I've been working with EDB for about 15 years now. The second that I took away is actually around the convergence of the markets in Asia. Instead of tackling Asia as a giant, we have to deal with many different markets. Yeah, and the extent to which we can forge more convergence, whether in terms of clinical practice or regulations, I think that's something that we aspire towards. What I came across the other day was between Singapore and Thailand, at least, there's a level of mutual recognition, even for Medtech. But certainly we hope that that's more of this, so more patients can benefit from the technology.
That ultimately would be my dream, is that from a Medtech perspective, Asia is not a sum of markets, but is actually a region that can lead.
That's right.
Right, and that in a reliable, predictable way. And I think it's 100% possible, but it's not going to be so easy. So like everything, one of my favorite quotes is opportunity is missed by most people because it's dressed in overalls and looks like hard work. And that's a Thomas Edison quote. But I think it's going to be the same as far as how we push forward here with innovation. But clearly we've come a long way over the last 25, 30 years. And at that pace, there's no reason to think that we can't go even further and even faster over the next 20, 25. I hope to have a front row seat.
Yes, you're in Asia. Yeah, hard work, but the prize is there. Well, and on that note, let us join me in giving Dan a big round of applause for his generous sharing.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, Dan.
Appreciate it.